Hi, I'm Martha, and this is episode 234 of the Service Design Show.
One of the biggest frustrations in our line of work is the pace of change. We can often already see a brighter future. We know the steps to get there, but it feels like the system we're in is designed to move at a glacial pace. It's easy to get disillusioned when your best work gets stuck in review cycles or seems to go nowhere for years. But what if that's not a bug, but a feature? And what if the secret to having real, lasting impact lies in a strategy that feels more like planting seeds that build momentum? That's what we're exploring today. Hi, if you're new here, welcome to the Service Design Show, where we invite the brightest minds in our field and explore what's truly needed to design great services that resonate with people, push businesses forward, and honor our planet. Our guest today is Martha Edwards, a service design professional who has seen the inner workings of government from almost every possible angle. She's worked at the municipal, provincial, and federal levels in Canada, but the moment that truly changed her career was when she went to work for the UK's government digital service. She describes that experience as seeing a parallel universe that reshaped her entire mindset about what's possible in public services. Now, what's remarkable is that while she's a keynote speaker who has graced the stage at major conferences, she's also a self-described introvert who once had to change the story in her head to find the courage to speak up. That journey of reframing her own narrative is a perfect metaphor for the work she does every day. Now, for our conversation, it's important to note that she's here sharing her own hard-won personal experiences, not representing any employer, which is exactly what allows for such an honest conversation about what it truly takes to thrive. So in today's conversation, you are going to learn about how to make smart compromises without sacrificing your professional integrity, practical ways to stay patient in complex systems that are designed to move slowly, a simple reflection exercise to recognize your small but meaningful wins, why sharing your work openly is the best way to multiply your influence, and why the energy you bring to a room is your most effective tool for change. What I found most surprising in this chat was how we ended up talking about joy and energy as professional tools. Martha shared a simple but profound question a manager once asked her to figure out what work truly energizes her and what drains her. It's a powerful reminder that to have an impact on the system, we first have to manage our own energy and find ways to stay hopeful. Whether you are feeling a bit frustrated or simply looking for a more sustainable approach to your work, this episode offers a fresh and deeply human perspective. Alright, there's so much to unpack here. So join me for this thoughtful conversation with Martha Edwards, and I'll stick around for the end with my closing reflections. I'm your host, Mark Fontijn, and this is the Service Design Show. Welcome to the show, Martha.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, we are going to try and find clues today to a puzzle that I know many service design professionals, especially working in the public sector, are facing or experiencing or working on the puzzle. And that is sort of to maintain a sense of hope and an optimism in a system that's maybe where the odds are stacked against them. And I think we'll be able to find some clues in this episode. You've got a lot of experience, firsthand learnings. Before we jump into all the intriguing bits and pieces. I'm curious, how would you describe the current state of public service design?
Yeah, so right now in public sector service design, I would say it's always challenging to be a designer in the public sector, but I think especially right now, there's a lot of, if we look at what's happening in the States with a lot of their sort of Doge efficiency stuff, there's some really great teams that have been cut. There's a lot of layoffs happening. In Canada, where I am now, we don't have quite that intense sort of political movement, but we've had recent federal and provincial elections where government efficiency has really been, a top election point. And so a lot of people, I think, are feeling really anxious about, public sector in general and how our design practice is going to um, play out in the current climate. I've seen across, my networks in Canada and the UK, I've seen um, people being laid off. I've seen, vendors and consultants having their contracts cut. Yeah, so it's a really scary time to um, be working in public sector and to be doing design, which is, I think, sometimes um, not seen as quite as essential as some of the other disciplines in government. And so, yeah, I think all of us are really thinking about how we can sort of future-proof our work and protect our practice. And I know a couple of people that I worked with at the UK government just gave a talk at a conference in Europe that was specifically about that, about protecting our practice. So Cara Kane and Martin Jordan, there's a recording available that I think is really helpful to look at the current climate. But yeah, it's a bit of a tough time for all of
Hmm.
us.
And when we look at the fact that design is maybe having an even harder time inside the public sector, what do you notice on, maybe not on a project level or an organizational level, but on a personal level? Like, what do you hear when you speak to your peers?
I think there's just uncertainty um, about what we can do to sort of add value in um, in the current situation. I want to be really careful not to sound like I'm representing design as a whole. This is just sort of like my personal experiences. But yeah, I think um, there's a mix of like wanting to see it as an opportunity and see it as a place to sort of lean in and show the value of what we add to the organization. Um, and a lot of times, like it can feel a bit hard for a designer to do this, but I think it's kind of um, having to like take a step back from being a designer and being really sort of protective of this specific practice and kind of embracing our identity as actually public servants and saying like, caring more about what's good for the organization right now than what is good for our practice. And so I think maybe more than usual, we're having to kind of like make a few more compromises about the things that we would usually um, sort of ask for and kind of just see how we can be useful and add value to what's going on.
And yeah, no, it's always important to reflect on how we can be useful. And I'm curious how it's changing nowadays. But even though working in public sector has always been challenging for service design, you somehow managed to stick around for 20-ish, 20 plus years. And we're super curious, like, where do you find meaning? What keeps you going and keep coming back to this field?
Um, I would say it's only been about 15 years that
Okay,
I've been
well,
doing
rounding
it.
up, yeah.
Yeah, it was actually kind of my second career. But I think I've worked for four different government organizations, so across I've worked municipal, provincial, and federal in Canada, and also UK government. And I think, moved around quite a bit, seen, how different governments are the same and how they're different. Um, but in terms of like why I stay, I think when I first joined government, so I used to be like a freelance writer and journalist, and really I enjoyed that for a time because I saw it as a way to sort of like surface information that people needed to know. But working for like big media organizations, I started to see like a lot of sort of corporate interests kind of like taking precedent over, like the the need for factual information. And so when I moved into government, I saw it as, this is a place where we're only really interested in like serving people, the citizens and the public and the people who live in the places that we serve. Um, so I found a lot of meaning in that, in being in a place where the main value of the organization is to serve people. Um, and it's a place where I feel like we do really meaningful work. Like when you are in government, you can work on really interesting areas. Um, you can work in understanding justice and the prison system, or you can work on social benefits, or you can work on healthcare initiatives. You can also sometimes work on so-called boring things like service design for procurement or for financial reporting and stuff like that. But those things also have really big impact in helping government to deliver better services. And so, um, I think it's really important what government does, and I think public services are really important. And I like that I get to be a part of that. And I mean, most days it feels like I'm a really small part of that. But it's just, it feels like, um, I just feel fortunate that I'm able to do that and do that work and um, serve the people that live in the place where I live.
I'm curious, how do you um, how do you keep on sort of finding that gratitude and that fortune, even if you're part of a system that's maybe challenging you in many ways, pushing back, delaying things, and here you are still being grateful for that opportunity.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think one thing that comes with, being in government for a while now and sort of seeing different organizations is I've I've kind of seen how change can happen really slowly sometimes. And I mean, sometimes, if you have an urgent priority, change can happen really fast, but most of the time it's happening quite slowly. And so there's been a couple of examples where, I've done really, you know, impactful, interesting work that I thought just really, advocated for people who needed more support with government services. And, I did everything right to kind of make that case. And then it ended up going nowhere. But a few years later, I hear that, someone is looking back on my research and now they're moving it forward. And, I've seen that recently too, where some work that another team did, 4 or so years ago is just kind of getting work done now because, it took that long to get the funding in place to actually make something happen. And so I think like having that kind of longer term view, I can see that like, okay, just because something doesn't go somewhere right now, that doesn't mean that it's never going to go anywhere. Um, and so, I gave this talk a few years ago at the SD and Gov conference that was all about planting seeds and how government is about sort of planting the seeds of change. And, if you come into government just thinking like, oh, I'm going to fix it and, I'm going to change things right away, you're going to be disappointed. Like, unless you're at very, very senior levels, it's not going to happen. But if you kind of like adjust your expectation towards, um, the things I do now will have impact in the future, that can really help. And I also think like even on days where I feel like I'm not doing as much as I would like to, like I can still think about the things that I've done and think, that did move something forward for people in even just a really small way, even if it's just, helping redesign a PowerPoint that's going to go to some senior executive like that is helpful. Like that is slowly moving things forward. Maybe it's not as fast as I would like it to, but um, it does make a difference. And so I think that has helped me to kind of keep motivated and yeah, keep going.
Yeah, recognizing those small wins, and then just if you stack enough of them, then eventually, hopefully, it compounds and adds up, and things start to move. Uh, One thing I'm curious about, and maybe we can go back to that, is that you mentioned you've been part of a few different government organizations. You've been in this for about 15 years. Um, my hunch tells me that your initial idea of what success looked like might have been different. Like, could you maybe take us on the journey? Like, how did you move in your career from starting out or moving away from journalism into where you are today? And like, what were some of those uh, big learnings, maybe?
I guess it was probably like 2010. I was working as a freelance writer, and I got this sort of short-term contract in our local government in the city that I grew up in, the city of Calgary. Um, and so I joined as like a content writer to help them with some of their web content. And just, I just really liked the work. And, it helps that I worked. The first government thing that I worked on was the parks department, which is like, that's like kind of the best thing to work on in government because it's like the one service that like people just really want to use. Um, and so, yeah, really, really loved working on the parks content. And then one thing that I found frustrating, and, I really feel for all of the content designers out there because, I'd get a lot of sort of stakeholders kind of pushing back on things and they'd say, well, like, I don't know why we need a content writer because, like we all speak English, we can all write, like, we can just do this ourselves. So I got really frustrated with that, trying to say like, oh, but this way is better. But I started to also think like, is this way better? Like, how do I know this is what works for people? And so that's how I kind of like slowly moved into user research as a way to sort of say like, what does work better for people, and how can I get that evidence of um, you know how this service should work or how this content should be formatted. Um, and so from there, yeah, started doing like a lot of like usability testing and user research. And then I ended up moving to London, UK to attend a design course. And then after that was finished, just kind of thought I really liked it there. And I'd also seen a lot of stuff being put out by the UK government from this team called Government Digital Service. And it was just like so different from how the rest of government worked. Like they were really open with how they did things, and they were really clear about what their mission was. And it just seemed like a really like interesting place to work. They had such a sort of human way of talking about what they were doing. And so I thought, oh, maybe I could stay and work there. And so luckily, like having government experience already, managed to get a job there. Um, and then, after that, I just kind of seeing like how government can work and how you can really put people first, and how you can have a whole organization that just is really focused on like delivering really good services to people. It was just really inspiring to me to see that kind of um, focus on user needs and on you know high quality services. And then that opened up a lot of doors for me. I ended up working for the Canadian Digital Service in the federal government in Canada. And then after that, I went to the provincial government in British Columbia on the west coast of Canada, which is where I work now. Um, forget what was the original question that ended up just being me sort of
No,
like
no,
talking
it's
about
super.
my work history, but
Yeah, no, super interesting to get to sort of get the journey perspective. Well, we started out by looking into how you identify impact and maybe how you quote unquote measure success.
mm,
So, like the question here is, do you feel that that has changed if you compare to where you were 15 years ago to how you
mhm.
now look at what success looks like?
Yeah, I mean, I think when I came into government, and I think this is, you know, I don't know this for sure, but I think a lot of people, especially sort of younger and newer in their career, might come in this way and sort of thinking like, oh, you know, government is fairly ineffective, and you know, I'm going to come in and I'm going to, you know, show my experience and I'm going to, you know, help them change. And um, I think like now that I've been in government for a while, I'm thinking it's a very you know, that's not the right expectation to have. It's also, you know, in Canada we do a lot of thinking around the impacts of colonization, especially on our Indigenous populations, and that's a really like colonial way of thinking of it, of things, and coming in and being like, oh, you know, I'm gonna show them what they're doing wrong, and I'm gonna change things, and that, you know, I think like what has changed is my expectation and my understanding that like I'm not really here to fix things. I'm here to um, you know, approach things with curiosity and just really seeing how I can serve the people that work here, um, and seeing how I can add value to that. Um, I think there was a really good blog post published by someone named Kuba Bartwicki a few years ago about how designers can show up in government, and he said that thing which got me thinking about the colonial nature of that mindset. He said like don't be like a design savior or a design colonialist.
Mm-hmm.
When you go into government, you know, we're really here to be curious and to serve and to, um, you know, to help the teams that we're brought into. So I would say I don't know if I've changed how I measure success. Like I still think that success really looks like, you know, building services that work for people, and I that hasn't changed, but like my expectation of how I do that has really shifted.
And can you elaborate on how has it shifted?
Yeah, like just what I was saying about, you know, I'm not here to fix government. I'm here to understand why things are in place, and see how I can help be part of whatever priorities are given to us by the government that we serve.
You mentioned the government digital services a few times. How was it for you to go back from an environment like that, going back to Canada and experiencing, I don't know, a different kind of environment? Like, what do you feel was the biggest difference?
I would say, you know, going from government digital service to Canadian government, it felt it felt like kind of coming into this parallel universe where, you know, it's kind of like all like there's very similar rules. Like, you know, if you look at sort of their procurement policies and even like how government is structured in terms of the Westminster system, um, you know, a lot of the things were the same, but they, you know, the two organizations had just sort of, or the two kind of like countries had just kind of approached how they're going to do that differently. Um, so, you know, it's been really interesting, and I'm trying not to, you know, I've been really trying not to come back to Canadian government and be like, oh, they're so behind what they do in the UK, because, you know, I think that's a colonial way of seeing it. You know, it's not necessarily, you know, that they do it the right way and, you know, other governments do it the wrong way. It's sort of like understanding what works in our context and like sort of applying the rules that we have where we are and the situation that we're in. Um, but I would say a big benefit of having worked at government digital service is like I've sort of seen what's possible, and that if you have really strong leadership who's really committed to like doing things in a user-centered way and really overhauling how we deliver services, like there are ways to get it done. And so that's been interesting, and it's made me a little bit more willing to kind of question things when people say like, oh, we can't do that, and I'm like, oh well, why can't we do that? And um I think I try not to be like, well, when I worked in the UK government, like, I feel like people get a little bit tired of that. But, just being curious and asking, why, like, you know, or, what is possible? Like, if we can't change this certain thing, like, are there other things that we can look at? Or, where are the right sort of um, things to push on, or threads to pull that sort of might help us in our delivery of services.
Yeah, I can imagine that it's super. This is quite challenging to go quote unquote back to an environment that is maybe has a what's the right word, isn't yet as design mature around that, and sort of knowing that you'll probably move slower
Mm.
and make I don't know if less progress, but less visible progress and impact. Yeah, that can be challenging. What do you feel is are some of the things that you took with you or that you learned along the way that you're trying to implement in your work because you've seen that they actually are the things that move the needle?
So one thing, probably the biggest thing for me is really thinking about open sharing. So in the UK government, when I was there, um, we had the saying like, make things open, it makes it better. And it was really like a big focus on, opening things up, like regular communication and blogging and sharing work, and just being really, sort of public about what we're doing and why we're doing it, and, what our standards are, what our expectations are. Um, that really shaped how I thought about the work. And I think it's been really impactful for me and really opened my eyes to how important it is to share work and to make your work visible, and not just sort of let it sit in these folders that go nowhere. So I've tried to really embrace that kind of spirit of like, I try and do like fairly regular blogging of like what I've been working on and what I'm thinking and what my challenges are. And I try to do sometimes other blog posts I try and share on different platforms like LinkedIn and Blue Sky. But yeah, just like sharing is so impactful. And so I think I talked a little bit about how government's kind of like planting seeds for things to happen later. And um, I see sharing work and kind of putting it out there in writing, um, that were, what we did and how we did it. It's the way of like watering that seed, because then anybody can come across it. Anybody can see what was done. They can learn from it. They can be inspired from it. If somebody is working on that same problem, like they are able to, maybe take it forward based on, what you've done and build on that work. And I think in government, this can be really hard to do because a lot of times we feel like we don't have permission to share. But I think, if we want to have really big impact, we have to kind of like ask that question and ask for permission. And I mean, ask for it in a useful way where, like, so that we don't just get an instant no, but um, ask to share work. And, like I haven't worked for GDS for a few years now, but I still look back at blog posts that were written, like 5, 10 years ago, and, just for inspiration and, how they did things. And is so impactful to be able to share what you're working on and what you're thinking. And I mean, I still get, people contacting me over blog posts that I wrote 5 years ago and saying like, I found that really interesting. Like, can you tell me more? And, could I learn from that experience? And yeah, I think being open about what we're doing and sharing is really important.
So sharing and being open sounds like a interesting quality. When could you give us an example of where you feel that by sharing something out in the open, I don't know, that an outcome has changed, or like what is the impact on you next to people just quote unquote just reaching out?
So yeah, so I can give an example. So a few years ago, I did some work to understand people who had um, a lot of trouble using a service that I was working on for various reasons. It was, the people who are typically marginalized, people on benefits, people who are immigrants. And so did, did some really great sort of research work and, really made the case for why we should prioritize building in some supports for, those people who were using the service. Um, and so I wrote about it. I also made sure that it was really well documented, like in kind of this open folder where people in that organization could be able to see it and could quickly kind of get up to speed and could use all of those research insights. And then, not long after that, I left that team and kind of thought, oh, that's going to go nowhere. But um, probably like 3 years later, I sort of saw something. I think it was on Twitter at the time, but someone saying like, "Oh, I'm working on this problem, and I just found this really great, research that was done a few years ago, and like this is so helpful for me, and now, I'm, you know, better able to like build the case for taking that forward." And so I'm like, that is like that seed that was planted by me and my fellow researchers and designers that did that work. um, and now it's getting picked up, and now it's a completely different service and product now than it was before, and they're really prioritizing those user needs. So I mean, that's that's like a direct example. But even like when I look back on things that other people have shared, like it has really helped me to increase my own impact, because I'm able to see what worked for other people and what didn't work for other people. And I can kind of use those learnings to kind of formulate my own, business case, or formulate my own approach to how I'm trying to understand a problem. And so, um, yeah, I mean, I don't know how you'd kind of like measure that specifically, but like, it definitely does help to share that work.
When you share stuff, have you seen patterns in the things that seem to be the most helpful or the most useful or get the most I don't know attraction? Do you share the outcomes? Do you share the process? Like, what would you recommend us to share? Maybe.
In terms of sharing, like I think the things that I share that tend to have the most sort of impact on people are times when I kind of show like a little bit of vulnerability. So, like for example, one thing that people keep kind of like contacting me about is I did this blog post and also a talk that was about how, as a service designer, I've never actually been able to do co-design. And like it's kind of the thing where people, service designers are supposed to do co-design. We're supposed to share power. And I was kind of saying like, I've actually never done it. And it's not, I kind of like walked through like, these are sort of the barriers to, why I haven't been able to do co-design, and why, it just hasn't felt right for my projects. And so, I still get a lot of people sort of reaching out and being like, thank you, like I was feeling the exact same way. And, you've helped me to kind of, see that that's maybe not my fault. And it's sort of more of, the kind of context of whatever I'm working on. So that's like something that's impactful in sort of making people feel like, if they're having challenges, like it's not just them. But I'm always trying to also like provide some kind of useful takeaways from that, and not just be like, these are the challenges that I have. So yeah, like in that sort of talk and blog post, I sort of said like, here's how you can assess whether co-design is something that is something you can do in your project, and here's something that you could do to kind of make a business case for it. But I think just being candid about what the challenges were, like what you would suggest for overcoming them, um, can be really helpful. And like, I would say I don't usually share like really specific things about my projects, and sort of like the methods that I've used. I don't share like, the journey maps or whatever, but I think um, I like to share kind of like the thinking process that I went through to kind of get there, like sort of why I made certain decisions. And I think that that can help people sort of um, see different ways to think about a problem or to approach a problem, or, just different ways to see a challenge.
That's super helpful. I can totally see how sharing the emotions and sort of the personal journey through projects, the people connect with that because it's relatable and not just like the fancy frameworks or tools or methods or recipes. Um, have you also ever written something about the fact that you need to stay patient inside a governmental organization?
Yeah. So I mentioned that I had done a conference talk about how government work is like planting seeds. So yeah, so I have a recording of that talk. Or actually, I don't have a recording. Never mind. Forget that. That was a different talk. But I did do a follow-up blog post, and I'm happy to like, I've given that talk at a few sort of smaller communities, and always happy to share that talk again, if there's any communities that are looking to learn from that. But yeah, I mean, I'm really happy to share like the slide deck. And yeah, I did sort of write a shorter version as a blog post of that talk.
So I haven't seen it or I haven't read it yet. But what I know from a lot of service design professionals around me is that one of the challenges we have is that we already can see the brighter future. We already see the possibility and the potential outcome, and we just need to take the steps to get there. And it's never going to be quick enough. Like we want to get there tomorrow, and we get frustrated when the system isn't moving as fast as we would like.
Mhm.
I don't know if the post was about that, but if it was, please share with us like how do we navigate that, and if it wasn't, how do we navigate that?
Yeah. So I think a thing that I focused on in that talk and blog post is about sort of being clear on like understanding what you have um, control over, what you have influence over, like really being honest with yourself about what you do have power to impact or change. Um, and like, we see a lot of like these kind of like big systemic issues, and like it's frustrating because we know that there are some things that we could do to change them, but we don't have that in our power to do that, with the situation or the context that we're currently in. Um, so yeah, so I give some practical examples of like these are things that I did to kind of slowly sort of nudge the kind of like better future that I want to see. So for example, I showed an example of I wrote this business case for why I thought that we needed another designer slash user researcher on the team I was on, and sort of like, wrote it in a way that sort of met the expectations of the leaders in my area, was really clear about the business value, and just kind of like formulated in a way that sort of speaks their language. And yeah, just sort of like worked on that case for that one designer where, the brighter future I see is like we should have multiple designers on every product team. But I don't have any control over that, but maybe I can build a case to get a designer on my team, and maybe I can talk about that and I can share how I did that. And other teams can sort of learn from that and use some of the lessons that I've developed in that process. So yeah, so it's about like finding what you can maybe influence and just sort of taking these small steps to kind of like nudge things in the right direction. And yeah, being really open about that and sharing what you're doing with that.
Does it help to when you need to write it down because you're going to share it? That you're also articulating the small wins, the small steps, also maybe the challenges. But um, if you don't take the time to reflect, like everything passes by so quickly, and at the end of the week, you're like, what have I done? What have I contributed to? Does that
Hmm.
reflection help to sort of get you a sense of
Yeah,
accomplishment?
yeah, for sure. Actually, this is something I kind of came up on recently. So yeah, I definitely agree. Like taking the time to reflect and look back on what you've done is really helpful. Um, so I am kind of like one of the organizers of, we have a BC government design community. Um, and so a few years back, we did some research into designers that were working in our organization, and just like their experiences, and if there were any challenges that they had in their design work. And so did that research, sort of collected those findings. We tried to use it to kind of like advocate at some sort of more senior levels. And at the time, it kind of like didn't really go anywhere. It didn't feel like it went anywhere. But recently, we actually did a reflection exercise with the community where we sort of like took kind of like 6 challenges that we had found in that research and sort of said like, hey, like, are these still relevant to you? Like, it's been a few years since we did this research. Like, are these still relevant, and has anything been done for that? And we found in like actually putting that together, we're like, oh yeah, like we did this and this and this and this and this. Like, every single thing, there had been something that had been done to make that challenge easier. And I have to give credit to my colleague Marlika, who's like actually was the person who did most of the things that sort of made those things move those things along. Um, but like, like I had kind of thought like, oh, that went nowhere. Like like I didn't see it as a failure, but at the same time, I was kind of like, oh, like I probably should have done that better. Like it didn't nothing really happened. And then actually taking the time to reflect and sort of like do it openly with a group, and like actually seeing like we hadn't fixed those problems by any means. Like um, they we hadn't kind of like achieved that future state that we would like with those challenges, but we had done small things and we're continuing to do small things. And so um, yeah, that was something, a good reminder for me that I should be doing that every year, and sort of thinking about like, it might feel like we're not going anywhere, but you know we just have to sort of take the time to recognize the small wins that we've made along the way.
Once a year even seems well. Maybe it's the speed of the government that once a year is a nice cadence. At
Yeah, I
the
mean that's for our design community, like,
Sure.
which is kind of a bigger initiative. I mean, for me personally, I definitely like I reflect. I used to do it every week, then every 2 weeks. I kind of do it every month of like, these are, the things I did, the things that went well. So yeah, I do think on a personal level, reflect often, on a team level. But yeah, design community, we reflect once a year, I think.
Super important, especially writing it down, not just thinking about it, trying to capture it. And even if it's just your private notes, you don't share them with anyone else, even though sharing is probably going to multiply the effect of your learnings. But even if you
Hmm.
just write them down for yourself, that's
Yeah.
a very good exercise. Yeah.
Yeah, and it also helps like reduce your workload later, because there's going to be a point where you're going to have to kind of like, like for example, you might be doing performance conversations and you'll have to sort of talk through like what you did this year. And like, I found it so useful to kind of keep these like week notes or month notes where I can be like, oh yeah, and I can kind of go through the
Mm.
list. And so yeah, I would say, keep track of what you're doing, and yeah, just kind of like make time to see what's happening over the long term and not just the immediate term.
I want to go back to a point that you made at the start of our conversation, and I think that was related to not just being a design professional, but also focusing on being a public servant and being flexible around that. I'm curious, what did you mean with that?
So I think when you're someone who's working as a public servant and you're a designer, you're kind of always having to kind of like, it's like you have two identities. You have your identity as a designer, you have your identity as a public servant. And when you work in the public service, like that identity as a public servant is, it takes precedence, because that's the industry that you're in. There's certain rules and responsibilities around being a public servant that are more important than, the specific discipline that you are trained in. And I think what I meant about that is that, because of the context that we're in and sort of, um, maybe like the rules and the policies, or the restrictions, or just a bunch of organizational things that might be happening, we can't always do our design practice in the way that we would like. um, like an example would be like, if you were doing a full sort of service design project, you'd want to have like multiple months to kind of do that. But there might be a funding thing where, it has to be done by this specific date. And so you're asked to kind of like compromise um, a lot of sort of methods or things that you think are important in order to meet that deadline. Um, or there might be other issues where you're trying to do a user research project, and because of that specific context around that service or area, you're actually not allowed to talk to the users, and so you have to find ways to um, kind of like do that design work under those restrictions. And so I think it's kind of like, it requires a bit of compromise and a bit of being flexible, and sort of like just really being reflective on like, what are the things that you can compromise on, and what are the things that you feel like it just really undermines what you're doing as a designer. And I guess, yeah, you have to be flexible to what the organization needs from you and requires from you. And do what you can to kind of like preserve the integrity of the design process and the work that you're doing. But also be willing to see that, you know, sometimes we just have to do things a little bit differently, and not, you know, um, maybe not in the way that we would choose to do them if we had a different context.
Could you share a story where you've been in a situation where you had to um, maybe make this compromise, and sort of where you felt that your design standards were what's the right word? You couldn't live up to your professional standards, and how did you deal with that?
I guess an example, like I talked about how sometimes you might be working on something where you're expected to do kind of like user research or human-centered design process, but you're not actually able to talk to the humans that are affected by the service. Um, and so, I've been in a few situations where I've been expected to do that, and it's kind of felt a little bit to me like, how can I do human centered design if I can't involve the humans? Um, but I think, um, so for me, it was first off sort of looking at other research that might have been done that's related and kind of goes back to sharing and making things sort of available for people to see and look at. Um, I was kind of able to look at some other research that had been done on a similar area and kind of like use a few of those insights to inform what I was doing. I was also able to look at people within government who maybe had used that service. I was lucky that someone that on my team had been through that experience, and so I was able to kind of like get some insight from that person. Um, but at the end of the day, like it's kind of like doing the work as best you can, but also kind of like using that to kind of like build kind of the trust and understanding to kind of like nudge it towards where I want it to be the next time that we do it. And so, by me kind of being flexible to that and willing to work with those restrictions, I think it created a good relationship with that team and kind of built their sort of trust in my ability to kind of like work with them and um, like work within their restrictions, and that kind of got me some buy-in to do work later on, and kind of like influence whether I could, actually talk to humans the next time.
And did you, in this specific case, explain explicitly like what the how you'd normally approach this, and that in this case you'd be willing to be flexible and sort of compromise a few things, so that like the next time they approach you, that isn't the expectation, that the compromised approach is the approach you always take. Were you explicit in that?
Yeah, I was. So, I mean, kind of right from the beginning when we were first talking about it, they're kind of telling me what they want to do, um, build out this journey of people. And so, I'm saying like, oh, well, when can I talk to the people? Um, and that's when the conversation happened. And, like I'm sort of saying like, it is really important that we do talk to people um, in situations like this. So yeah, so I did set the expectation, and um, one thing I would say like with I've had this situation actually. I'm kind of being vague about it because I'm as a government employee I can't sort of give specifics or you know um, give too much detail. But I will say like I have had that situation happen actually a few times in my career. And, I would find like I would say like every time I encounter that, it's not so much the team like being like, we don't want you to talk to people. It's like they really want you to, but they're sort of getting direction from somewhere else that you can't. And so, um, it's kind of like, I don't know, they're like, I just feel like it's pointless to kind of like, make a stand in that case because, they are also frustrated that, they can't do this the way that they want to. Um, so it's kind of like just being understanding and saying like, being curious and asking them, what do you think we could try next time to kind of like get this done the right way? Or, what can we start planning now or planting the seed for so that we can do this in the future? And yeah, I think, yeah, just being curious and having that conversation early is really important.
That makes sense. And I totally see how this could, if it goes well, build trust and build credibility and open doors for a different approach or better approach or more elaborate approach next time. Um, okay. So you already have shared a lot of practical things about sharing, communicating openly, thinking about the small wins, tracking what you're doing, staying patient, making smart compromises. Now, if we are listening to this and we got inspired and we would like to see a little bit more hope, optimism, and create a little bit more impact around us, what would you like if you could recommend one thing for us as service design professional? Like, what would that be?
I think it would be, I mean, this is maybe going to sound a bit cliche, but I think it's really important to find joy in what you do, and like that can feel really difficult sometimes, especially when there's just so much going on and so much that you're worried about or you're feeling you know hopeless about. um, I think one of the really something that's been impactful um, for me was like a few years ago, a manager asked me the question, which was, um, what is a task that when you do it, time goes by really fast? And what is a task that when you do it, time goes by really slow? And so it was like this really practical way for me to kind of like see, like, okay, what brings me joy? Like, what do I love doing so much that, time goes by really fast? And what do I not love to do? And that has kind of helped me to sort of like lean into those things that bring me joy and make me feel really satisfied with my work. And, not to say like, we don't all get to do jobs where we just do the things that we like all the time. We're always going to have to do those things that make time go slow. Um, but, like understanding what brings you joy and what you like doing it's been really impactful for me in terms of, just, yeah, just kind of structuring my day around like the things that I like doing, and making time for them. um, that's been really helpful, and I can honestly say, like, someone was saying to me, like, that someone not in my organization, but we were just having a coffee chat, and she works in public sector in a different organization in a design role, and she was kind of like, oh, I dread so much about my job, and you must feel the same. And it was kind of an aha moment for me, because I thought, like, I don't actually, like, I don't dread my job. Like, I actually feel really fortunate to um to have this job and to be able to serve the people in the place that I live. And like, I think a lot of that has been understanding what brings me joy and what's important to me. And yeah, that's had a really big impact on me and on my quality of life.
It's a very profound question, and one that could be very useful for a weekly, bi-weekly, monthly, yearly reflection cycle. And this is, I think, a very nice segue into the final thing we do here on the show, and that is to ask our guest for a question for us to linger and think about. Now, it could very well be this question that you just posed, but maybe there's something else you feel is worthwhile to think about.
Something that I would encourage people to think about is, what is the energy that you're bringing into the spaces that you show up in professionally? Um, are you, yeah, I don't know, are you showing up as someone who's joyful and curious and, just happy to be in that situation and to work with those people? Or are you, I mean, I think as service designers, we can sometimes get caught up in problems. Like, we see so many challenges and we think about challenges all the time. And so this is definitely something that I have made a mistake of in my in previous experiences, where I've just sort of shown up and been like, look at all these problems, and like everything's on fire. And um it hasn't really served anyone very well. It has led people to dismiss the thing that I'm trying to do, and it's actually been um completely, it's had the opposite effect that I wanted it to. And so if you want to have impact, you really have to think about that energy that you're bringing in and how you're making other people feel when you come into these rooms or professional spaces.
What energy are we bringing? That's something interesting to think about, for sure. Martha, for all of us who are interested in the things that you share, is there still a place available online where we can find you and potentially connect?
Yeah, so I have a website, marthaedwards.ca. I have lots of blog posts like in my archive. Like I have kind of just been focusing on week notes and month notes recently, but I want to sort of share more openly and sort of write more thought pieces. I'm on LinkedIn, Martha Edwards, and on Blue Sky as well. So yeah, would love to connect with anyone on any of those places.
Awesome. As always, we'll make sure to add the link in the show notes, links in this case. Martha, thanks for coming on, sharing a little bit about your journey in government and public service design, bringing a little bit of optimism and hope to all of us listening. So keep doing what you're doing, and thanks for sharing it with us here today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And just like that, we're back. A big takeaway from this conversation with Martha is the powerful reframe of our work as planting seeds. It's so easy for us to get frustrated by the slow pace of change. But the idea of patiently contributing to a future you might not immediately see is such a healthy and sustainable way to think about impact. It's a reminder that our value isn't always in the finished product, but in the slow, deliberate work of nudging things in the right direction. So a huge thank you to Martha for sharing her hard-won wisdom with us. It's a message of hope that reminds us that the work we do today truly matters for tomorrow. Now, if you enjoyed today's conversation, you can do me one big favor. Click the like button on this video and most of all, leave a short comment if you haven't done so already. Not to feed the YouTube algorithms, but to let me know whether or not we are on the right track by addressing topics like this. Finally, before we part ways, please take a moment to reflect and celebrate that by joining us today, you have directed your attention towards learning and growing as a professional. So, from everyone who you are going to impact through your work, thank you for taking the time and making the commitment. My name is Mark Fontijn, and I look forward to having you with us again for a new conversation on the Service Design Show. Take care and see you soon.